Come, let me tell you of someone who heals, who does miracles like none other does. The more you see of God in me, the more I can reproduce in you.
Welcome to Very Scary People. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. The Jonestown Massacre. More than 900 people died there. The youngest victim was just 5 weeks old. The oldest was 97. And the man responsible was Jim Jones. Wildly charismatic for decades, Jones was idolized by his flock, but he used his church as a way to con people with phony cures and take their money. He sexually abused his followers and was obsessed with death. Disturbing behavior that traces all the way back to his childhood. A man of extraordinary contradictions and seemingly unlimited gifts, Jones could have done anything. But what he chose to do is almost unimaginable.
Good evening. We're interrupting our special broadcasting to bring you this special report.
We here at NBC News have been trying to establish what happened last night.
I remember him saying he was God.
Let's fill this atmosphere with warmth and love.
Bodies are strewn all over the place.
I was a zealot. I believed in it.
The word on everybody's lips was shades of Auschwitz.
Love is a healing remedy.
The death toll is rising as more bodies aren't being found.
I also have to warn you that what you're about to see almost defies description.
I maintain to be and declare to be your only savior.
I think history will eventually come to see our Father.
I don't care. I'm really not sure what the end was for my father, what if there was a great grand plan. What I saw my father doing is shooting from the hip much of the time. And he was managing perception.
I shall do all the miracles that you said your God would do and never did.
Jones became a master performer as a preacher, and he gravitated towards the Pentecostalist style of preaching, and in doing so, he embraced faith healing.
Here comes the woman healed of cancer. Here she comes.
He didn't have the power to heal, and therefore we need to fake these healings.
Now, is the pain gone?
He would do this thing where he would say, lean your head back, close your eyes, put his hands in your mouth, and it wasn't cancer he was pulling out of you. What he was putting in your mouth was fermented chicken pox.
Deceit is pernicious, and it started back then.
Jim Jones was supposedly a good man gone bad. It couldn't be farther from the truth.
Jim Jones was born in a little town called Crete, Indiana, in 1931.
Crete was just a dot on the map, had 3 or 4 houses, a grain elevator, and a railroad track. That was it.
It's just a little Hoosier town on the Ohio line. The moment I think of it, a great deal of pain comes.
In 1931, Indiana is almost a century behind a lot of the rest of America. It's about the whitest area in America you can find. The Ku Klux Klan has been sort of forced out of the South and has made Indiana its new stronghold. It's very conservative, very religious.
He was born to a relatively poor couple. It was in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a time when poor people certainly had trouble making ends meet.
I had less of material comforts, although my mother made every effort to give me what she could.
Jim Jones's father, also named Jim Jones, is a World War I veteran.
My dad was ill, an invalid from World War I, very bitter, cynical person.
His mother, Lynetta Jones, was the sort of spirit of the family.
Lynetta is bold, she's brassy, she's pushy.
His parents lost their farm when he was a toddler, so he was raised in nearby Lynn, Indiana.
He has a mother who is resentful of her working class place in life and tells him, even as a toddler, you are going to be the greatest man ever. You were born to be great.
Jones stood out among others of his peers as a child as someone who was precocious.
He could cuss up a storm. He was much smarter than the rest of us kids.
But even at age 10 and 11, Jim Jones had a dark side. During World War II, German POWs were sent to Lynn.
I remember one occasion, up pulls a Greyhound bus, and the first guy out was carrying a carbine, followed by about 10 or 12 tall men, and on the back of their coveralls was POW. And I'll never forget, this one patted Jimmy on the head, and he said something German. These were German war prisoners. Jimmy turned around and said, Heil Hitler.
He's fixated on Adolf Hitler. How Hitler can stand in front of huge crowds and just by force of personality make them worship him and follow him. And Jones actually admired Hitler committing suicide at the end, rather than letting all his enemies parade him around and feel triumphant in front of him.
And the other kids all thought he was strange, so that nobody wanted to be his friend.
I acted out against the conformities in the community. First way, because I was never accepted, or I didn't feel accepted.
I heard a lot of stories about Dad feeling like an outcast as a child. I suspect that to some he was very attractive, and others he was odd.
Jim Jones, from childhood, is also a con artist. He manages in this small town to convince all kinds of people that he's still a lost little waif. And he'll be invited in for meals, and he will tell the lady serving him that meal he's never had better food, that he just loves her like a mama, that she's been so kind to him, and they all just melt.
Dad knew how to win someone over pretty quickly, knew how to adapt to any situation.
Little Jimmy is fascinated by religion. He joins the Nazarene church, and then he joins the Methodists, and then he's over there with the Baptists.
He would organize pretend church services with friends. He would be the minister, they would be the followers. They would be listening, nodding along.
He would go out in the woods and practice giving his own services, and he would hold funeral services for roadkill. By the time he's a teenager, he's the one boy in town who goes to every church service and walks around carrying a Bible.
With Pentecostal services, he found this sense of belonging.
They were the most despised. They were the rejects of the community. I found immediate acceptance and as much love as I could interpret love.
Jimmy would go up every Sunday. He would go up and get saved. And I always thought that was a little weird, too.
Pentecostalism at its origins was racially integrated, and that's something that was very important to Jones.
And I'd early developed a sensitivity for the problems of blacks, too, probably feeling as an outcast.
He was never part of the accepted in-crowd, the social elite, as he called it. He felt a tremendous resentment towards people that he regarded as having more power, more privilege, and more money than he had.
By the time Jones was in high school, he was pretty set on what he wanted to do. He wanted to be a preacher, but not just a local preacher. He wanted to change the world.
He would gain information by searching garbage cans or talking to their neighbors.
It would seem like he's reading minds. All he's doing is eavesdropping.
I'd had my religious heritage in Pentecostalism, deep-rooted emotions in the Christian tradition.
By 1948, there were really shades of who he would become. He was charismatic, he was confident, but he was somewhat rough around the edges, a small-town character, but he had a pretty big chip on his shoulder. It was fortunate. He met the one woman who could really take him further than any place he wanted to be. That was Marceline Baldwin.
Marceline Baldwin, the daughter of a city councilman, was considered the most wonderful girl in town.
When she entered a room, she commanded respect. She had panache, but not in a pompous way.
I think Mom enjoyed that Dad was brash. She was definitely giving this young whippersnapper the cold shoulder for a while, because Mom was 4 years older than Dad. One of the ways Dad made himself more attractive to Mom is to talk about his religious background and his desire to be a minister.
They married in June 1949, and it was a double wedding. My father and mother were married in the same ceremony.
She is convinced that she has married a special man who will do special things. And as he begins an independent ministry in Indianapolis, she decides she will simply devote herself to him.
His first church was incorporated under the name Wings of Deliverance.
Jim Jones was 23 years old when he set up this church with mostly a poor African-American following.
Segregation very much was alive and firmly implanted in Indianapolis, like it was in many cities. There was an active Ku Klux Klan nearby. There was a racial divide in the city, and Jones was very bothered by that.
I think Dad genuinely cared about doing the right thing, but that was always snarled with his deep need for approval.
He began to be unorthodox in his sermons. He was incorporating kind of a political stance on the world situation.
At first, he tried to transform himself into Marceline's dream man, but then differences began to emerge.
He's difficult. He will not tolerate any views other than his own.
Mom started to see that Dad was not all he said he was. Mom was in conflict from early on.
She was the first victim to fall prey to Jim, his public persona. The first victim of Jim figuring out what somebody needed to see and hear.
My family thought he was a little odd, I have to admit, a little strange. But he had an air of authority, and he was very charismatic.
By 1955, his church is growing substantially.
This is a church that would reach out to people who were in need. If someone's sewer line broke, then other members of the church would come over and help. If there were people who were hungry, the soup kitchen would feed them.
But for his ministry in the early days, Jones needs money. He can't get it from his parishioners in inner city Indianapolis. They don't have any. So he goes out on the revival circuit.
Pentecostal services focused on faith healing and on salvation.
He sees quickly that the large crowds and the big donations come when people work miracles.
He would use the age-old practice of discernment, that is, being able to tell the future or tell things about people's past that nobody else knew. And he would gain that information by searching garbage cans or talking to their neighbors.
Then he can get up and he can start doing mind-reading things.
$350 was sent out for an uncontested divorce.
That's right, Bob, that's right.
And it would seem like he's reading minds. All he's doing is eavesdropping.
Jones began to use theatrics to ritually portray his success at faith healing.
He had people on his staff who would feign being sick. An old lady would leap out of a chair.
In the second row, you have a bad spinal condition. Step from your wheelchair. Begin to step from your wheelchair. Take that step. Bless your heart. Take that step. Now, move forward. Move forward.
He would have people who said they were blind who could see. All these sort of tricks of the trade that he had heard other razzle-dazzle preachers had used, he would use.
He's already inculcating in his followers the idea that sometimes you have to do things that seem wrong to achieve the greater purpose.
He said the Bible was false, and he threw it on the floor and stepped on it.
You don't believe that Bible only when you want to. King James put lies in there.
By the 1950s, Jim Jones is out on the revival circuit, and he's quite successful, but he's using lies to drum up donations and supporters.
So the ends justify the means. Lying to people by doing phony fake healing, it will help people have more faith, so therefore it's a good thing to do.
The more attention Jim Jones gets, the more influence he has. He's never going to be satisfied. He wants more.
He was so consumed with furthering his name and constantly feeding that need for adulation.
But while Jim was really focused on the church, Marceline wanted to have a family, and so she had this idea of adopting children of different races, calling it a rainbow family, to live out the church's ideas of racial equality.
They first adopt a couple Korean orphans. They adopt a black baby, the first white couple in Indianapolis to adopt a black infant. And they name this child Jim Jones Jr. Marceline discovers she's pregnant. They had one child themselves, a son named Stephen.
I love my family, but what I've come to believe about the Rainbow family is that too much of it was about the statement from Dad's point of view. Too much of it was about show.
In 1956, they bought the church at 10th and Delaware, which was a Jewish temple.
It became known as People's Temple. People's was the idea that this is not just one people, not just one race, not just one ethnicity.
An all-white audience is teaching people to hate black. That's why you better have a living and holy Jesus that teaches equality, that will take in all colors of the rainbow and serve all people.
A black man would not be allowed to say that. And to hear a white man saying those things, that definitely stood out. I was born into People's Temple. Early as a child, our mother just coming home and telling us all about this church and this man that was different, like no other.
In Indianapolis, black people simply can't eat at the nice restaurants. Jones will show up at a restaurant with a couple black people. Would like to come in. Well, no, we don't have any room for you. And he would point out, look, there's these empty seats. And then he'd start saying, it would really be a good thing for you if you integrate. You'll make more money. And he doesn't use force. He's a very persuasive guy.
Eventually, the Indianapolis restaurants gave in, allowing both black and white customers to sit and eat together.
He essentially integrates one of the most segregationist big cities in America. If Jim Jones had been hit by a car and killed on his way from Indiana to California, we would remember him today as one of the leaders of the early civil rights movement.
He's drawn crowds and developed a name for himself as a minister, but like all good con men, it was a bait and switch.
He changed the message. He said the Bible was false and nobody needed to read the Bible anymore, and he threw it on the floor and stepped on it.
You don't believe that Bible? King James put lies in there.
Dad's number one objective was to be number one to anyone in his world, and people's religion got in the way of him being number one to them. So that would be a major reason Dad would have a problem with the Bible and Christianity.
This is in the midst of the Cold War. He's talking about socialism and communism. It was all pretty revolutionary.
Jones' resentment of elites and moneyed people was something that dovetailed with his political communism.
No Cadillacs here, no Lincolns here, and no alligator shoes here. There's no wristwatch even on this wrist.
He would wear the same shoes, same cheap slacks, cotton shirt, and he never owned a car.
It seemed gross to me that one human being would have so much more than another.
In the 1950s in America, when the Cold War is ratcheting up, all across this country there is the great fear of nuclear war. Russia has the bomb. And more Americans believe that nuclear war is inevitable, including Jim Jones.
We have to be prepared to take our flight to the valley in the case of the apocalypse that would spring forth in a nuclear hell.
Back then, nuclear war was on everyone's mind. And I guess he read some article and said that the place that would be least likely to be bombed or whatnot would be Redwood Valley, West Coast.
Going to California brought the church to an entirely new level.
The more you surrender to the group, the more the group identity takes over.
It really is the end of a traditional ministry, and it starts to move in the direction of becoming a cult.
Welcome back to Very Scary People. Jim Jones has tossed the Bible from his sermons and begun to call himself the Savior. Many of his followers are convinced he can cure diseases and read minds. By the mid-1960s, there are ominous signs that the People's Temple is turning from a religious movement into a cult. The congregation believes they're working toward a utopian paradise, but in reality, it's the beginning of a nightmare.
Redwood Valley's for the great apocalypse. If we have a nuclear holocaust, then we're prepared because I've got a cavern deep, deep in the mountains that can take care of every one of you.
In the summer of 1965, around 70 families made the trip out to Mendocino County and ultimately settling in the little hamlet of Redwood Valley.
The first thing that I recognized was that some guy arrived with 3 busloads of people. There were mixed families, and we hadn't had that.
Shell shock, totally different, because it was all white people.
What Jones never factored in was it's pretty much redneck white country, and they will not welcome People's Temple with open arms. And he gets there and essentially has to start rebuilding again.
They went out and got good jobs. They contributed to the community. They seemed to care about the people that were having problems.
Jones does in Redwood Valley what he did in Indianapolis. He begins to meet with local officials and to make a name for himself.
He came to my office when I was running for local school board. He told me that I wasn't going to have any problem getting elected to the position because I was being supported by People's Temple, and would I like to join?
People's Temple began to attract a new middle and upper middle class contingent of whites. There were real estate brokers, there were lawyers, there were social workers, there were accountants.
Boy, when he got up on, he could just off the cuff preach and light you up. He really could.
The only thing that brings perfect justice, freedom, and equality, perfect love in all of its beauty and holiness is socialism. So socialism is law.
California, at that time in the mid-60s, the culture was ripe for disenfranchised and disillusioned people, anti-war, Vietnam, anti-government.
I came out in March of 1970. People thought that Jim Jones had kind of a socialist group. He was a minister, but he would talk from the pulpit about how he had spoken to Angela Davis or Cesar Chavez. He was one of the first ones to say, you know, you could be gay or straight. And so in many ways, he was out front in being vocal about human rights.
I first met Jones in Seattle, Washington. I was living there with my wife, Cheryl. We were an interracial couple. estranged from our families, and we were embraced. It was warm, it was welcoming, it was interracial. There was all different kinds of people there.
I moved in with nothing. I had no money. So Jim took me in, gave me housing and everything. You know, I lived communally, I turned in my paycheck.
As his membership grows, Jones begins to demand more when it comes to tithing, 10%, then 20%. It really is the end of a traditional ministry, and it starts to move in the direction of becoming a cult.
Cults will often ask members to give over their money, their paychecks, their houses, their cars to the cause. And of course, the more you surrender to the group, the more the group identity takes over.
There was definitely a call for conformity immediately upon coming to the temple. You got your hair cut, you were supposed to dress a certain way. You're basically your whatever persona you had before you came to the temple was molded into a kind of a cookie cutter appearance.
It's really about separating people from their past lives to this control of their thoughts and their feelings.
Jones began to warn his group about outsiders. It became sort of an us versus them.
Us against them would create fear in us. And that's the way a raging ego thinks. If you don't agree with me, you're against me. If you're against me, you're the enemy.
This community became tighter, more suspicious, more dedicated to the cause.
There were 60 or 70 of us who were on the planning commission, and we'd stay up all night, like every Wednesday night.
There was services on Wednesday nights, Friday nights, Saturday, Sunday. You, as an adult, were not to fall asleep during the service.
Then it got to be status. Well, how much sleep did you have last night? 2 hours. Well, I only had an hour and 45. So it got so that to show how dedicated you were, you got less and less and less sleep, which really fit right into Jim's plan.
Another universal manipulation by cult leaders to do mind control is sleep deprivation. Their critical faculties are not going to be functioning. Their memory is going to be impaired. Their immune systems will break down.
One of Jim's secretaries, he told her that if you keep people tired and you keep them poor, nobody will ever leave.
Jim Jones's rules became stricter. He began to monitor everything from a person's romantic lives to the type of food they were eating.
What about this eating too much? You gonna get on that? You owe it to the cause not to do that.
And when anyone broke a rule, there was a public accounting of their sins.
One woman wrote him a love letter saying, I love you, I want to be with you, I'll always follow you.
She was very enamored of Jim Jones and was bothering him about it. So at one of the planning commission meetings, he ordered her to strip naked.
He said, look at you, why would I ever be attracted to you anyway?
He led the group in mocking her body and then made her sit naked even longer before he finally allowed her to dress herself.
He just completely demeaned her.
And the next day, she wrote him a note apologizing for having done the terrible things that made him do that.
It's sending a message to everyone else. You better toe the line and do what we tell you, otherwise it could be you next.
I thought, this man who's supposed to be so loving, how could he look at her and say the things that he said, you know, about her? I mean, it was so cruel.
It's like being in a relationship and being in love and everything's wonderful and it's good. And then you notice, well, there's something that's not quite right, but you ignore it because you're in love and you want the dream.
There were a couple of times, and more than once, me walking in on him with a man or a woman, you know, in bed.
He is, in a sense, now a sexual predator.
Let's fill this atmosphere with warmth and love.
By 1972, Jones's ministry had expanded in Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it had really become the poster boy for community engagement. The church was bringing in more educated and affluent members, people who were really looking for the equal life that he had promised.
Jim Jones becomes the darling of the glitterati. Jane Fonda writes him fan letters. And then all the popular revolutionaries at the time, like Angela Davis, now they're coming to the meetings. He's building what he couldn't build in Indianapolis, which is not just a religious empire, but political clout.
During a close election, our votes could make a difference. We met Rosalind Carter, the mayor, city council, legislators, lieutenant governor. They all came through our doors and to court our vote.
And it was amazing that this man could get into a community and influence intelligent people. It's really scary. He was appointed by the mayor to be on the housing authority, which runs public housing in the city. He was made president. I was a City Hall reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. I went to the meetings. He would show up and fill this fairly small meeting room with all of his folks. Anything he would do would get this thunderous ovation.
Jones understands that power comes from numbers, and he's really trying to bring in new people from all walks of life.
I was in Los Angeles at the time, and Jim was at an auditorium where he was holding his meetings. I went up there with my daughter, and I thought, okay, I'll sit here for a few minutes. Jim was talking about people in bad relationships, and what he said was that women shouldn't have to put up with that.
I'm a woman. I'm liberated. I'm free. And of all the healings that are done in this temple, that's the most magnificent.
And that kind of hooked me. You know, I thought, oh, okay, a man saying this.
He's a chameleon. He can see what he needs to be, and he becomes that.
He said that all women should be treated equally, but he really didn't practice what he preached.
Marceline has her back give out. She's completely unable to satisfy Jim sexually. He announces to their children that since Mom can't do this for him anymore, he's going to have someone else.
He began engaging in sexual relations with other people. The most famous instance of that is Carolyn Moore Layton.
When I was still a boy, maybe 10, I met a woman that was strange to me. Her name was Carolyn Layton, and we spent the evening with them. We had dinner. It was clear to me Dad was just lit up by her. I was put on a sofa that night, and they were in the very next room, and I heard, what was going on in there. I had no idea what it was at first. I thought it was animals, the sounds I was hearing, and then I realized it was them.
I've been in prison in my mind for many, many years, constantly trying to conceal a lifestyle alien to the American society that would have caused great pain for my devoted and precious wife.
Those were the faith really loved Marceline. And she was really a sweet person.
If it turns out that Jim is being unfaithful to her, that's going to hurt him with some of his followers, and he knows it. So you've got to keep up this charade that Marceline is a co-equal partner.
Mom never lost her grace, but life in the temple as the wife of Jim Jones certainly wore her down.
Marceline is a tragic figure. We ask ourselves, was she also his great enabler? In some ways, she was.
That was a time where you stand by and slightly behind your man.
He wasn't going to let her off the hook because you couldn't leave Jim Jones.
Most members were unaware of Jim Jones's infidelity, but he had bigger problems to worry about that were very difficult to hide.
He turns to drugs, and Jones becomes a habitual user and, frankly, addicted to drugs.
Trouble sleeping, you take some pills. Trouble waking up, you take some more. Dark glasses all the time, indoors, outdoors, night or day.
With the increase in use in drugs comes something else. He is less circumspect about some of his own moral behavior. He begins having sex with members of his congregation, mostly young women who feel honored that Father is sharing this with him, and sometimes with men. It turns out he's bisexual and has been all his life, but he is, in a sense, now a sexual predator.
Dad's message to anybody he was sexual with is because they needed it or they coerced him to do it. But it was always a great burden for him to be sexual with someone, and I knew that was a lie.
He was basically just really exploiting people sexually.
Power, money, and sex seems to be the universal of what cult leaders are going after.
Like all drug addicts, particularly the ones who use speed, that just increases his personal paranoia.
Jones's paranoia will prove to be very dangerous to members of the People's Temple.
There was a shot, and he fell to the ground. Everybody was screaming and running.
Father's been shot, father's been shot.
Come, let me tell you of someone who heals, who does miracles like none other does.
In 1972, when Jim was doing a service up in Redwood Valley, he was out walking on the grounds.
And so at the lunch break, Jim Jones is out mingling, as he likes to do, and everyone else is eating.
There was a shot, and he fell to the ground. Everybody was screaming and running.
His chief lieutenants who were screaming, "Father's been shot, father's been shot." And everyone jumps up and is looking, where did the shot come from? Jim Jones is gently picked up by his followers and taken into his house, which is right by the church, to die.
Everybody else went back inside. It felt like we were kind of sheltered.
And everyone waits. Father is going to be dead. They're waiting for this terrible word. And instead, in walks Jim Jones, just fine, wearing a different shirt.
He showed his shirt. It had blood and a bullet hole where he said he had been shot. And he said he had healed himself.
I've come doing all the things you ever imagined God to do and have never seen done.
He opens his shirt so you can look at his chest and see that there's no wound, just some little sort of dent.
But the minute I saw that, I knew, okay, something's up here. Because I no longer believed he had the power to completely make a bullet wound go away. You're just totally full of it at this point.
He created this myth that you didn't have to believe everything he did because part of it was for drama.
You've never seen anyone shot down as I was before your eyes with blood spurting from the body and heal themselves, yet I did that.
As to why they'd fake that shooting. He was now supremely the center of attention. He was elated because he saw how distraught everyone was when they thought they had lost him.
Even if the danger to him had been faked, it began to feel very real to the people who had crossed him.
It was 1 a.m, and I was in planning commission, and I kept nodding off. Finally, somebody shook me and said, "Laura," woke me up, and Jim was pointing a gun at me. And he said, "Laura, if you nod off one more time, I'm going to shoot you."
For some members, the theatrics, the erratic behavior, had worn thin.
I thought, no, this is not for me. This is just not for me. I left April of '76, so I was out. I was done.
Any defection to Jim Jones was a big loss.
Dad was obsessed with loyalty, for sure. There was a part of Dad always that knew he was running a game.
Perhaps the biggest loss for Jones were the defections of Grace and Tim Stone.
Tim Stone was the attorney for People's Temple.
Grace was Tim's estranged wife, but she had become one of Jones's high-profile lovers within the church.
Grace Stone had had a child. Somewhere along the way, it was corroborated that that child, John Stone, was sired by my father.
Jones insisted the child stay with him. It was a way to stay in control, even as things were deteriorating around him. Grace and other defectors began talking to members of the media about what was taking place at the temple.
Found some folks who had left the church because they were unhappy. And they said that the church takes everybody's money, that the church overworks its people, that the church beats up or humiliates people who get out of line like us. It's really kind of a snake pit. It's not this warm and fuzzy social action group that it purports to be.
Life outside of people's temple is hell. Life away from Father is unbearable.
Jones wanted to test the loyalty of his planning commission. These are the people that are really supposed to be most with him. And one night in San Francisco at a planning commission meeting, Jones announces there's a treat. Everyone have a cup of wine.
We never had any refreshments at Planning Commission. We usually just go there and sit and listen. So we all drank it.
You might say I hypnotized with this holy love.
And when everyone's done, he announces it's poison, it's lethal, and they're all going to die within 45 minutes.
He said, we're going to commit revolutionary suicide.
And some of them are crying, I don't want to die, I don't want to die. At exactly 45 minutes, Jim Jones announces there was no poison, everybody's fine.
He was testing us to see how that was going to play. If he had handed out poison to people, were people going to just trust and drink it?
I never believed Dad would go through it. I thought it was a big game for him, and he was testing loyalty and just creating drama, which fed him in a way.
Of course, looking back, you see, it was grooming us for what was going to happen on November 18th.
That was the call of death.
Mother, 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 please. Don't do this, don't do this. Down your life with it, Dad, but don't do this.
Jim Jones was at a crossroads. By the mid-1970s, California politicians knew him as an influential minister capable of swinging an election. To most of his followers, he was a godlike presence that controlled nearly every aspect of their lives. But Jones was now addicted to drugs, sexually abusing church members, and defectors were starting to talk to the press. Jim Jones was losing control of himself, his family, and his followers. But Jones had a plan, one that would horrify the world. Next time on Very Scary People, the final terrifying days of the People's Temple. I'm Donnie Wahlberg. Thanks for watching.